Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Scottish Currency Group to inviting me to speak, and also to Tim. Thank you for that. I was asked to, first of all, a little presentation. I am the CEO of the Landsbanki. Landsbanki is the governmental bank of the Faroe Island. I've been there since 2008, but as a manager director since the last 8 years. Being the CEO of Landsbanki, I'm also the chair of the Risk Council that we have in place. I was asked to talk about the Faroe Island, how we are organized when it comes to monetary policy or financial policy. Faroe Island is an independent country within the Kingdom of Denmark. The Kingdom of Denmark is Denmark, of course, and then is the Faroe Island and Greenland. We do not have our own currency, and frankly, I don't think there has ever been a serious discussion if we should have our own currency. And I think it's because we are a very small country. We are 54,000 people, and we are depending on fishing industry and fish farming industry, so not very diversified. So also we are selling food, and that's good, but the prices are determined by the world market, not by ourselves. So they swing a lot. And if we would have our own currency, we would need to use a lot of effort to defend our krona. So our currency is the Danish krona. But I will say that the Faroe Island, being far away from Denmark and Greenland, we have our own language. We do not speak Danish, we speak Faeroese, and we have our own culture. And the Danish economy is an industrial economy, very dependent on competitiveness. And we are, as I told you before, a resource economy, fishing and fish farming. But we are independent, and we have, how is it governed? It's governed by the Home Rule Act of 1948. I can say that before I go on here, that we are tied to the Danish krona, but during the World War II, we were cut off from Denmark, but the UK were in the Faroe Island, and then we were tied to the Scottish pound, so some familiar. But in 46, we had an, referendum on independence, and we voted yes. But the Danish parliament didn't accept that, sent the Faroese parliament home, and the end of that was that we got the Home Rule Act. So there is a lot of dispute about that still in the Faroe Island. But still, we have the Home Rule Act. In the Home Rule Act, there are a list, and there are Faroese matters, and then there can be matters that can be negotiated and we can take over. And then there are Danish matters that we cannot. And the Danish matters are foreign policy, military defense, the legal system, and also the monetary system, which is determined the interest rate and the currency. Yeah? But we have the fiscal independence. Both the local municipalities and the central government, we set our own taxes. So the fiscal is totally our own. So we finance everything on our own. We collect taxes to finance. So we decide every decision to what we want to build, what we want to invest in is our own. We get a grant from the Danish government. It used to be about a third of the income. Now it's only 8% of the income. My belief is that we need to get that down to 0 before we can take a decision if we want to be a totally independent country or we still want to be with Denmark. Yeah. As I said earlier, we do not have our own currency. The currency is the Danish krone. So we do not have anything to say when it comes to the interest rate, and we do not have any control of the exchange rate. And further on, the Danish bank, we have 4 Faeroese banks in the Faroe Island, but they are controlled by the Danish supervisory, what's it called, financial supervisory authority. So they are still a Danish matter, even though we can negotiate to get that to the Faroe Island. But we have done something other. We have established the governmental bank, and it was established in 1978, and the first managing director was hired in 88, just before our very huge financial crisis. And the main task of the governmental bank is to the liquidity of the government, the debt of the government, and also the financial stability, which is an assignment of a national bank. So 3 things: the liquidity, and the debt, and financial stability. We had a very huge crisis in the 90s, very large, and all the liquidity of the government was tied in the banks, and they couldn't use it because they would make the situation much worse. So at that time, we decided on an act that the government in the parliament agreed upon, that the government has to hold 15% of the GDP in liquidity. And that corresponds to 3.7 billion Danish crown. You have to divide by 9 or something to get it in pounds. So we always have to hold that. So if we go below that, next time we go out to borrow, we need to borrow to get the liquidity up to 50. So it's kind of our reserves. And it's very good because every time we get a rating, which is, you can say, the rating, Moody's rates the Faroe Island, which is, you can say, how the world see the Faroese economy. The better rating, the better it is. The worse rating, the worse it will be. But they emphasize that we have a very good liquidity, so that's very good. So that it's an act that every politician respect. So instead of placing it in the Faroese bank, we invested abroad. So we invested in shares and bonds, but abroad. So so in need of, if we have recession or a crisis, we can bring it home without disturbing the economy. So that's a rule. Yeah, of course. And then we have to place it, and we do it with so agree upon the risk, and then we try to get as much interest as possible on that. We also administer the debt. Every time the government has a debt on its financial act, we need to finance it. So we borrow, and we do that by issuing bonds. That's the only way we can do it. We cannot go into a bank because we will be dependent on one bank. We do not like to be dependent on a bank, so we sell bonds out on the market. And that's why we also need the rating, so that the investors knows how good we are to pay our debt back. At the moment, the debt is 4.8 billion Danish crown. Again, you need to divide by 9. But we also have a company that built a subsea tunnel which is publicly owned totally, that has a debt of 2.7 billion, but it is self-sufficient. The traffic, we have a traffic you pay to drive through it, so that will finance the subsea tunnel. That subsea tunnel. And then we have this risk council, and then we try to monitor the Faeroese financial market. We look at the banks, we look at their lending, their deposits, and everything you do when you look at the financial stability. And then if there is something, we need to report to the Danish National Bank, because they are the authority. But every time there is something about the Faroe Island, because the Faroe Islands economy is not at all like the Danish economy, they consult with us. So that's how that works. And the legislation that Denmark put in place for the Danish bank, it doesn't automatically come to place in the Faroe Islands. They consult with us first, and then it's adjusted if needed. Oh, yeah. So the conclusion is that we have a broad independence, we feel, but we do not have our own currency. Denmark has his own currency, but it's linked to the euro. And I'm sure that one of the decisions of the Danish government in the 80s, when it wasn't going very good in Denmark, was that they wanted to exchange the floating exchange rate to a fixed exchange rate. First, it was tied to D-Mark, the Deutsche Mark, because Germany is a very important market for Denmark. But now it's in euro. So the Danish crown is within a bond euro. With euro. Sorry, my English. But we feel that we are very much independent when it comes to the economy, at least. And then I have one last slide, and that was because Tim asked me, how can you afford all the tunnels that we have? We like to build tunnels, and we like to build roads and bridges. This is the national national accounts, so it's the public investments that we have from 1998 to today. And you can see the blue, the big one. That is infrastructure. So the Faroese politicians, they love to build roads and subsea tunnel and tunnels. And the big one here is we have a subsea tunnel. I think we are the only country that has a roundabout in a subsea tunnel, which you can see there. And our very famous Faroese artist has made a dancing ring, because we have chain dances in our culture around the roundabout. So it's quite famous. But it's costly. And they plan to, at the moment, my concern is fine, because we do investment in roads and tunnels and stuff. That's fine. We have 21 tunnels, where 4 are subsea tunnels, and in kilometers, it's 75.6 kilometers. But there is very little investment into social, what do you call them? Social affairs, which is elderly, taking care of the elderly. And as everywhere, I think, in the Western country, the population gets older and older, and the people that are in working age get fewer. So we need to prepare for that, and we do too little with that. We like to build roads.
Thank you. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked about the demographic challenges of ageing, and given you've got a population of about 50-odd thousand, has there been any discourse, technically, and also a technical discourse and a political discourse around an emigration, bringing people in?
Yes, we are only 54,000 people, and the economy is going very well. the fish farming is doing very well, and also the pelagic fishery is doing very well. And therefore, all the other economy around it is doing fine. So we need to import people to work, and we do that. I think about 7% of the workforce now is foreign or not Faeroese people.
Hi. I'm interested in tunnels. Before I moved to Glasgow a couple of years ago, I spent 10 years in Argyll, which in Scotland terms is a bit like, I think, the Faeroes. It's lots of islands, lots of fjords. And I spent multiple attempts with the Scottish Government trying to get them interested in infrastructure in Argyll, connecting bridges, connecting tunnels, putting in rail links. All the time, can't afford, can't afford, can't afford. We can't do infrastructure in the west of Scotland. We can do it in the east, but not in the west. But the question was, you've done it. Was it worth it? And is there some magic that can be used to persuade the Scottish Government to do it?
When it's done, of course, it's worth it. It's connecting all the Faroe. I think about 90% of the Faroese people are connected by roads and tunnel. But it is expensive, and you know, in the budget, we use always a proportion to investment, and most of the investment has been into roads and tunnels, as you see. Of course, it's worth it, but right now the decision is, should we build a tunnel to the southern island, which will cost a lot of money, and the traffic will not be so much that they could finance it. And this, that we are getting people that are more, or the elderly care, we need to invest in that. So we need to choose between a little, you know, should we have roads or should we take care of our people? So that's the kind of dilemma right now, but the economy is in a very good state from the beginning, but yeah, what we need to do is up to discussion.
Is the Faroese economy self-sufficient, or do they rely on some financial support from Denmark? And if so, what sort of conditions do they try to impose on you for that?
Oh, Denmark has told us that if you want to be independent, you can just say so. That's because they know that we are not, we do not agree upon it. It's about 50-50. Who, you know, it swings a little, but around there. So if we wanted to be independent and the people agree upon it, I think they cannot do anything. They need to apply for that. And I think that if we can make ourselves economic independent of them, reducing the grant to zero, it will be an easier choice for the people. I think that's my opinion. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
I want to talk about the tax system in particular, because when you're talking money, you have to talk tax. Let's be clear about that. Let's preface the whole of what I'm going to say now on that basis. If you're going to have an understanding of money, which is that the government spends it into existence, you have to have tax as a fundamental key component of a fiscal policy to ensure that you withdraw that money from circulation within the economy to control inflation. Not all of it, of course, that is the delicate fiscal balancing act. But I actually wanted to start talking about the nuts and bolts here, because I think we've discussed this issue around the idea of modern monetary theory and whether we can use and how we can use tax for the purposes of fiscal control previously. So I wanted to talk about how I see the Scottish tax system developing and what ideas should be implicit in that. So let's, as a matter of fact, start off with the fact that everyone presumes that Scotland will inherit the UK tax system. And as a matter of fact, the only precedent there is for this is Ireland in 1922, and it did indeed inherit the UK tax system and made it the Irish system. But let's presume that there is a significant time lag, 3 years or so, between independence being announced and actually happening. There would be an enormous amount of work to do because the tax system that the UK has is not fit for purpose in an independent Scotland, in my opinion. In particular, Scotland would need to reform the way in which tax is administered. Just as we had Danny Blanchflower, my mate Danny, we worked together a lot, talking earlier about the Monetary Policy Committee and how that might need to be different in an independent Scottish central bank. So would Scotland need a different type of tax authority. The UK tax authority at present, HM Revenue and Customs, is run as if it's a private limited company. And it has a board that is made up entirely of people who basically come from large firms or banks. That is not representative of the people of the UK. So we have to have people who understand how the economy works, but how it works for real people and real businesses, and how it also works within the macro economy. And that tax as a tool for recovering money from the economy is also the single most powerful single instrument available to the potential government of Scotland to influence the way in which it shapes the society of Scotland in the way that its government will then want. That is what I once called the joy of tax. Can we have the next slide? The tax authority. Oh, we seem to have lost something there. Okay, well, let's carry on with this slide because I didn't think this is where I was going next. Tax is not a draconian measure. I think that's inevitable. So I think we've covered most of it. Let's carry on. I know we've got a time limit. Tax transparency is key to the way in which the Scottish government must work. If it is to really succeed in taking people with it, tax at the moment is viewed as an enemy. Tax shouldn't be viewed as an enemy by people. Tax is the inevitable consequence of having a government engaged in the delivery of services of benefit to the people of Scotland. That is my fundamental premise with regard to tax and fiscal policy. All of that needs explanation. I am bored with having governments who keep saying, we can't discuss fiscal policy outside a budget statement. We can't discuss the fiscal policy after the budget statement because now this is being cast in stone. Actually, all the time, fiscal policy is a subject for debate by government. This stupidity of that there is complete budget purdah until something has been said and then nothing further can be said has to go. The government of Scotland will, if it is to have a truly transparent and effective fiscal policy, have to be incredibly transparent about what its goal will be with regard to its objectives for taxation. How is it going to use tax to control fiscal policy, but also to influence social, economic, and industrial policy in Scotland? Unless it is that, it won't work. But it also has to be clear about something else. And we are very bad in the UK at present at doing this. It has to be both transparent about the budgeting process and about the subsequent accounting process. You try and find a comparison of accounting outcomes with budget forecasts inside the UK tax system, and you will have great difficulty in finding what you need. The OBR is not very opaque, the Treasury less so. So, frankly, this is just not good enough. We need governments to be clear about what they're doing about tax and clear about what has happened with tax so that everybody can learn lessons. And Scotland will, if it's going to be innovative and take its economy forward, it will have to be clear about the fact that there are tax gaps. Tax gaps at the moment are appraised by HM Revenue and Customs. In other words, it marks its own homework. Unsurprisingly, the tax gap has always remained small, according to them, and on a declining trajectory, because that's what the management want us to believe about them. It also has to have a tax spillover analysis, something that hasn't been done. Tax spillover analysis appraises the causes for tax gaps and what remedies are required. So, for example, the biggest cause of tax gaps in the UK right now, in my opinion, is the fact that company law is not enforced in the UK as a whole. Therefore, it is incredibly easy to form a company without any form of regulation. And we had Roger Mullins talking about the difficulties about company formation earlier today. These companies are formed for fraudulent purposes. They create an opportunity for tax evasion. We get the consequence. of unpaid tax. 30% of all corporation tax due by small companies in the UK is not paid according to HM Revenue and Customs. So we need to be open and transparent in Scotland about what the goals will be. Next slide, please. But this also requires a change policy for the management of taxation in Scotland. This is part of fiscal policy as far as I'm concerned. Taxpayers have to know what they're being asked to pay. There's a critical idea here called tax morale. Tax morale fundamentally influences the willingness of the taxpayer to make payment of the sum demanded from them. Unless the taxpayer believes that they're being dealt with openly, transparently, and honestly by the tax authority, they will not in turn be open, honest, and transparent in exchange. So there has to be a tax authority that is fully invested in Scotland, and which will provide effective communication, including support in the place where the person lives for what they need help with. The UK tax authority is fundamentally withdrawn from the communities of the whole of the UK. In Scotland, it means that basically there are tax offices now in Glasgow and Edinburgh, which isn't a lot of use to you in Inverness or Portpatrick or in the Orkney Islands or wherever you might be. The point is, the tax authority is far removed from people. There has to be a fundamental change of attitude from the government, from the tax authority, to engage people in this whole process of understanding. Next. I'm finding those slides on the left-hand side of the screen very disconcerting. Sorry about that. Scottish society is at the moment, as far as I can see, deeply divided by unequal distribution of income and wealth, in some ways even more so than the rest of the UK. That's particularly because we know that there's a very unfair distribution of land ownership in Scotland. If the tax system of Scotland is not only going to be fiscally relevant in the sense that it actually raises the revenue to counter the risk of inflation that results from the government spending, it also has to be socially relevant. This division within Scotland of income and wealth is something that tax system has to tackle, is the point I'm making. Any Scottish government that doesn't make this at a core objective is going to fail to meet the needs of Scottish society. Next slide, please. So we need wealth taxes, but we don't, and I will make the point very clear somewhere on here, we don't eventually need a wealth tax as such. I am a pragmatist when it comes to tax, and I'm going to be a pragmatist when it comes to the role of wealth tax within a Scottish economy after independence. There will be a great deal to deal with these stresses that wealth is creating inside the Scottish economy. It's dividing the society. It's putting far too much money in the hands of those who don't spend it, and therefore have very low multiplier effects as a consequence of their earnings. The money that the wealthy hold doesn't tend to fund innovation. The wealthy are incredibly reluctant to take risk because the most important thing for them is preserving their wealth, not taking risk to innovate. Status is the only thing that really matters to them. Power is concentrated as a consequence, and resources are denied to the people who need it. So we do need to create revenue. Oh, sorry, let's be clear. We don't need wealth taxes to create revenue. We know governments can do that, but we do need tax to manage the consequences of revenue spending. So to create a fairer Scotland, we need to raise additional taxes from wealth for two fundamental reasons. One, to tackle the inequality. Two, to relieve poverty. Next slide, please. That means if we follow this pragmatic line that I've got of avoiding a wealth tax because it would take far too long to introduce and require far too much expenditure of political capital with the opponents, and let's be honest, there would be opponents to a wealth tax, then we need to move to pragmatic measures. All of these, by the way, are described in something I call the Taxing Wealth Report, which I wrote earlier this year. So you can find it at taxingwealth.uk. That's the website address. We need a capital gains tax charged at income tax rates. Scotland should do this. It's glaringly, obviously necessary. It's incredibly politically popular. If the UK doesn't do it, who cares? Scotland needs to be talking about this as a source of revenue for an independent Scotland. There also needs to be reform to inheritance taxes. They are incredibly generous to the very wealthy at present, who can take advantage of reliefs and allowances, particularly agricultural property reliefs, many of which apply to landed estates quite inappropriately, and the arrangements for businesses and trusts are also too generous. There needs to be an investment income surcharge in Scotland. An investment income surcharge is the equivalent of national insurance, but charged on investment income. It would go through the tax return of a person with significant investment income. By that, I mean anybody who might have more than £5,000 a year from investment income, which is a significant sum, in my opinion, and they would be charged an additional income tax rate on this. It existed until 1985. Margaret Thatcher got rid of it. It worked. In fact, it is even still in UK legislation. The legislation was never repealed. There simply isn't a charge now. There would need to be a change to the reliefs on gifts and allowances. One of the great frustrations I feel that for Scotland has at present inside the current absurd tax rules is that, for example, the Holyrood Parliament can change the income tax rate, but it can't change the rate of allowances and reliefs on things like pension contributions. Those pension contributions are at present costing the UK as a whole roughly 70 billion a year in terms of subsidy, or 7 billion roughly in terms of Scotland's cost to this, maybe very slightly less. It would be possible to recover 1.5 billion in Scotland at present by restricting those reliefs to basic rate only. It would be simple, it would be straightforward, it could be done at a moment's notice. It's just the devolution settlement doesn't allow it. An independent Scotland must talk about this. I don't know why existing politicians don't highlight what they could do, things like this, to explain why they are literally operating in the current Scottish fiscal system with one hand tied behind their back. VAT should be charged on financial services in an independent Scotland. It would make no sense not to. Corporation tax would need to be charged at higher rates, and also significantly less generous reliefs, because at the moment they are providing far too many reliefs for investment, which are not being matched by new investment as a consequence. And there would be a need for a progressive land tax in Scotland, particularly to deal with that problem of the sports and leisure estates. These can all come before a wealth tax is ever needed. Can I make a plea? I think it's the next slide. Please do. Oh, no, this is something slightly different. I will come back onto it in a moment. Let's also remember that poverty is not best dealt with by taxation. It is true that the rate of exemption for local tax charges could obviously be reduced or increased, so therefore local people would pay less if they were on low income and in lower value property. That would be appropriate. We would need generous rates of low rate tax for those on low income in Scotland. I'm not saying necessarily to take everybody out of tax, but I think that there is a real room for a starter rate of income tax inside a low tax Scotland, paid for by this redistribution, by effectively charging much higher rates on some, lower national insurance rates on low earnings, because national insurance is a very penal and rather sort of slamming tax when it comes into operation. But in particular, there should be more an enhanced benefit system in an independent Scotland. Really important that that is the case. Without that, I do not think that any tax move will work to the best interests of the people of Scotland. Next slide. Plus a plea. Whenever you're discussing tax in an independent Scotland, or even before there's an independent Scotland, I've made this point several times already, be pragmatic. Do not seek the perfect for the sake of getting something that's much better than what we've got. This is so commonly what I hear. Right now, everywhere I hear people saying, let's have a wealth tax. The Trade Union Congress, based in London, not the Scottish TUC, has estimated that a wealth tax in the UK could raise £10 billion. Let me put that in context. By simply removing the pension tax relief at higher rate from those people who enjoy it, I could raise £14 billion. A wealth tax would take forever to introduce to get 10 billion. That one change to one relief, which would raise 14 billion, could slip through in any finance bill with ease. So go for what is pragmatic when it comes to tax. It is really important. And last, I'm trying to give quickly because I want to leave room for some questions here. I think this is the last slide coming up. Read the Taxing Wealth Report. That's it. That was my last slide. There are masses of ideas in there, and I mean masses of ideas in there, to talk about how we can do tax. Nobody would ever want to do them all. Fundamentally important point. But to pretend that there are no choices available to Scotland to provide for a modern tax system, accountable tax system, that could not provide the fiscal support that is necessary for Scotland in an independent country, or even now, if there were more devolved powers, is nonsense. The options are available. Have a look at them. Thanks a lot. Let's take some questions, I hope.
Hello, I wanted to concentrate on one point in your slides, which is that we will need to have enhanced benefits in Scotland. I agree, but I wonder whether we need also a different principle, which is that welfare should not be means tested. The standard objection, of course, is that you don't want to give the benefits to the people who are rich, but obviously that is a silly objection because you can recoup that welfare through higher taxes for those people. So I wonder whether you agree with.
I do fundamentally agree with that point. I mean, we're seeing this at the moment with the winter fuel allowance, and I'm very worried that once Labour has decided to means test the winter fuel allowance, next it will be means testing the right to an old age pension altogether. And I think that would be their next logical step, because these are a bunch of Austerians who seem to be determined to crash our economy. Do not underestimate the threat that Labour is putting forward at present with regard to the well-being of a great many people who are on the margins in the UK. The winter fuel allowance is a little crazy. Obviously, it's an anachronism that is the result of something Gordon Brown did a long time ago. £300 a year, 200 for some, tax-free. Why? No logical reason. It would be better to pay it to everyone, however, than to try to withdraw it from somebody like me. I am an old age pensioner. I'm still slightly shocked by the fact that I am, but nonetheless, I would, at the time I became an old age pensioner, have expected to get this payment, and now I won't. Is it really worthwhile all the difficulty that is being created to decide where this boundary is? The boundary that Labour has put in place is obviously a wholly inappropriate one. Pension credit is in itself a cliff edge benefit. You either get that and a whole load of other benefits as well, or nothing at all. So it is possible that the pension credit system is extremely penal. This has obviously had repercussions into Scotland, and I know the systems are not quite the same, but fundamentally there has been a spillover from one system to the other. What we need to see is a system where the benefit system is made as easy to access as possible. Now, I know from my experience, and I was a practicing chartered accountant for 42 years, that most people are petrified of a tax return. But most people have never come across many of the forms that are required to claim benefits, which are much, much more complicated and provide a massive barrier to claiming benefits, let alone the fact that digital barriers also exist for many of the most needy. So to have as many benefits as possible on the basis of automatic entitlement would be a policy that I would support. Yes, there's a cost. Some people will inappropriately get a benefit. But look, remove other tax benefits from them, like pension relief or whatever, and you will rebalance the system easily, is my answer.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Hello. Just wondered what your thoughts were on the AGFA type of tax proposal, the annual ground floor rent, roof and rent proposals, if you're familiar with that.
Look, I've read them. This is where I become a pragmatist again. I'm not saying people should not imagine new taxes and long-term tax reforms. But when I look at taxation and where we are and where Scotland needs to be and what has to be done, there is so much that is capable of being delivered without trying to innovate new taxes at present, that I am reluctant to move too far in that direction right now. Suppose we, get somehow or other, somebody works out how to get independence, and I sincerely hope somebody's going to. And then we have 3 years to move from the day when Scotland decides to be independent to the day when it is. That 3 years is going to pass incredibly quickly. Commonweal, I know, has looked at that issue and has written a program for 3 years of transition, and I contributed to that program with regard to tax. But my point is that there will be so much to do to, at the same time, be talking about major innovations is going to be very difficult. So whilst I would encourage people to think about what can be done in the long term, I also think that there is a lack of thinking at present, and has been a dramatic lack of thinking about what to do with the system as it is. And I think in part that's because there aren't enough people engaged in the process of discussing tax reform who've actually worked in tax. So it's easier to think up a new tax, which is something that economists are very good at, rather than thinking about reforming existing taxes, which is somebody from my background as an accountant, more as an accountant, is comfortable with. I may be wrong about that, but that's why I think we've ended up with a lot of proposals for wealth taxes, land tax reforms, and so on. But we actually aren't looking at the detail of what could be done pragmatically to come up with a pretty good situation without major tax reforms.
Okay.
I wondered if you had any thoughts on the taxation of trusts, offshore trusts, or large estates that are registered as being owned offshore.
Yeah, tax them on somebody. Just ignore the fact that there's a trust. I mean, you can have a legal trust if you want, and you can therefore have a system put in place that guarantees the way in which this asset will, or subject to tax being paid, move from generation to generation, or whatever it is that you wish. A trust is, in a sense, a form of living will. But don't provide that trust with a special tax advantage as a consequence. The trust should be during the course of a beneficiary's lifetime, taxed as if it belongs to the beneficiary. That is what we call an interest in possession trust now, and such things do exist. But I would simply deem that if no one else is potentially considered to be the interest in possession, then the trustees must be. And the assumption should be that tax will be charged at the highest rates if nobody else comes forward to admit that they had the benefit of the trust. And charge inheritance tax, capital gains tax, and other charges on that trust, again at the highest marginal rates, on the assumption that nobody else is accepting liability for them. I think you'll find that trusts become pretty unattractive pretty quickly. Offshore trusts, we are beginning to get some decent information. I spent a very long time working on offshore issues and negotiated for a long time on how we did break some of the secrecy in offshore trusts. I think that has begun to work. I think we are now getting information. They're pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much becoming equivalent, except for non-domicile people. And I obviously hope that the domicile rule will go and it will have nothing to do with the Scottish tax system. But pretty much they are becoming the same as onshore trusts. But the system is simply make them as if they're people and charge the highest marginal tax rate. And that way you'll discourage their use pretty much overnight.
Thank you. Any other questions for Richard? Leslie? And then we'll come to the ladies at the back next.
Hi, Richard, just a quick follow-up on the question of the land tax. If you don't like, if you think the land tax idea and the move towards that is too disruptive in the short term, and bear in mind, for a lot of us, we've been in the short term since the council tax was meant to be abolished in 2007, right? So we're kind of getting bored with this and annoyed. Do you think it's things like, for example, there's a small business bonus that somehow the large sporting estates manage unbelievably to cash in on? Are you thinking, and I think the Greens have actually talked about trying to crack down on that. Is that kind of crackdown, removing the perks, if you like, at the moment, is that what you think is more feasible in the short term?
Yes, I do. I guess that's a Leslie I know. And if so, hello. Yes, we should be looking at doing something like that in the short term. So, as I mentioned, I think we do need to have a look in Scotland. And Scotland has this very particular problem of intense concentration of land in this way. I don't think there's anybody in England who understands how big Scotland is. and therefore that there are such intense land ownership issues in Scotland. It's almost beyond their imagination. And so Scotland does require a different solution. I would be looking at reforms that, first of all, deny reliefs to these estates, and secondly, might actually impose extra charges on these estates unless there are very specific conditions attached. For example, making land accessible, making it a public utility. Keeping this land closed for the use of a very small number of people for so-called sporting purposes, to me, is basically not only antisocial, but an obvious symbol of the concentration of power in the hands of some at cost to the many. So there could be reforms around that particular issue, but I wouldn't be going all the way to a wholehearted reform of all land taxation. I would go to a partway step to deal with the very obvious issue that this gives rise to. I think it could be done as well.
Right, I think we've got a couple of questions at the back here.
Good afternoon, Richard. I'm from the Salvo Free Ports campaign. You spoke briefly there about tax avoidance, tax evasion. How do you see the revenue for Scotland now with having the 2 free ports and the 18 SEZs? What kind of impact do you think it's going to have on Scotland and Scotland's economy overall?
Look, I see these free ports and the SEZs as being Trojan horses at the present. They do have the most significant impact, in fact, on local authority taxation, because they basically exempt areas from local taxation. And that's significant, and there have to obviously be ways around that. They also have significant impact on employers' costs, because the whole logic of the free port at the moment is by and large to actually reduce national insurance charges, which of course are not inside the devolution settlement at the present point of time. So they are a Trojan horse by setting something up. The arrangements are absolutely crazy. I could use stronger language if you wished, but it is well before the watershed. They create enormous zones where there is effectively an absence of regulation, which is the same sort of characteristic that tax havens had. They move the boundaries in a way that is unpredictable. In fact, totally unpredictable, because you actually can't identify the boundaries on a map very often, certainly physically, even more so, of what these places are. They're warehouses dotted here or there or whatever they might be. So they are designed to take certain activities outside the scope of regulation. That is deeply abusive. The SNP should be, I personally don't believe the SNP should ever have let these things happen. There should have been a policy of non-cooperation. They don't generate new wealth. They don't generate new jobs. At best, the evidence is they might encourage the relocation of jobs from outside the free port into the free port, but they certainly don't appear to have any net economic benefit whatsoever, except to the owners of the businesses within them. So in the long term, the policy with regard to these issues is get rid of them. In the short term, it is constrain them, and it is also to actually heavily regulate those who have supposedly taken on the job of regulating them. In other words, the Scottish government should be making sure that any company that takes on the job of regulating the boundaries of these places to make sure that tax benefits are properly applied only to activity within them are really doing the job that is required of them. I very much doubt that there is any such oversight at present. And I think that would, again, be something that would make them very unattractive. One of the ways to beat these things is just to make them horribly unattractive.
Okay, now was there another question along the back row there?
Yes, I began my career as an inspector in what was then the Inland Revenue in the late 70s. And I then moved out to Arthur Andersen and Ernst & Young. Now, at that time, the Inland Revenue was an incredibly professional organisation. The accountancy firms were also very rules-based. And there was a general consensus that the two should be kept separate. That sort of accountancy firms had, to be kept out of government and nothing to do with tax raising. Now, 40 years later, that has all gone. The HMRC is just not what the Inland Revenue was. There's a kind of revolving door with the accountancy firms and government. Tax offices have all gone locally because they're viewed as a cost and not as a benefit. So I think my question is, what you're suggesting about transparency, I think it's great, we should be doing, but as well as the technical tax issues, is there sort of a massive kind of psychological issue in reversing 40 years of governments just going in one direction?
Yeah, there is. And we've got to do the PR campaign for that. I mean, that's quite important because, I mean, one of the things that I view tax as is the sort of the consideration in the social contract between the people of a country and the government that is, well, literally governing them. And as a result, has the right to extract, and I would argue whether they do really extract, but whatever it is, they demand payment of tax. And so there has to be a better understanding of this relationship because, as far as I can see, there's a very, very poor understanding of what government does, what the role of tax is, what the role of government spending is for, and so on. And I've often drawn attention to the fact that most local authorities are much better at explaining their finances to their local representatives, the people who vote for them, than our governments. And the best accounts that you can curiously find anywhere that I've ever found issued by a government are actually issued by the governments of the Isle of Man and Jersey, which is kind of ironic. But actually, they're incredibly transparent about what they do with tax. And yet the UK government isn't. We have the most appalling data. It is very difficult to get hold of any information at all. And there's no attempt to communicate any of the benefits of government. So one of the things that I think identifies Scotland as having such a different psyche as a nation from England. And I know England well, obviously, but I learned quite a lot about Scotland. And that is that Scotland actually believes in government a lot more than England ever does. It still sees a positive role for government. Of course, not everybody. Let's not be naive about this. But I think it is generally more open to the role of government. And it needs to be broadcast that this is relevant and appropriate and that there is a positive role for tax. This is why I want tax officers in every community. I mean, there should be a tax office in Dunfermline. It makes no sense that there isn't a tax office there because there are people who are paying tax who need help. And they should be able to get it from people who, as you say, were at one time incredibly professional and incredibly well trained. I mean, I won't go back to the early 80s in my practicing career. So we're roughly of similar age. And I can remember when I first set up as an accountancy practice, the local district inspector, a man called Bill Patterson, who was very definitely from Scotland, came to see me, even though I was in South London at the time. And we established a good, respectful, strong rapport from each side of the debate so that we could discuss openly and honestly with each other how to make sure that the right amount of tax was paid in the right place at the right time. That's the relationship that we need to create about tax in a modern Scotland. The Scottish government could and should be doing that now. There is obviously already a Scottish tax authority of sorts. It should be trying to take control of this and say, look, we want to do this, but instead we end up with this absurd things like JERS, which are designed to destroy faith in the Scottish government. There's no positive selling of the benefit of government, of taxation, of strong fiscal rules, of government intervention, or anything else to deliver the Scotland that Scotland wants. Scotland needs. And that to me is a tragedy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any final questions for Richard? Yeah, we've got, we'll just take one final question, Richard, if that's okay. In the back here.
Thank you, and I listen to you every day. It's an education.
Sorry.
An education. One, what about an industrial water rate on Big Whisky? And two, do you have a relationship with the, it used to be the Inland Revenue, their own separate union, but I assume it's now the PCS. Do you have any discourse with the PCS? And what about a special industrial water rate for that biggest and fragilest of our industries, Big Whisky?
That's a question I've never thought about. I've never researched. I don't know the answer to. And so I'm sorry to say I don't like answering questions I don't know what to say on, so I won't. Because I'm sorry, I literally have nothing to add because I've never thought about it. And I only answer questions where I've got something of relevance to say. That's been my policy for a long time. PCS Trade Union and I had a very good relationship for several years. Then somebody called Jeremy Corbyn came along. Andrew Fisher wrote his policy to become leader of the Labour Party. They borrowed a whole pile of my ideas. Jeremy got elected as leader of the Labour Party. And then John McDonnell and I couldn't agree terms to work together. I wasn't a member of the Labour Party. And as a result, I apparently became persona non grata. So PCS have never talked to me ever since, which is a shame, I think.
Appreciation to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
The currency issuing central bank would have the power. Oh, sorry. Well, I'll start again. Would I be right in thinking that a currency issuing central bank, such as we are hoping for Scotland, and such as is supposed to exist in England, would have the authority to create money and to borrow money in order to fulfill its requirement to support the government's finances?
Can you hear that? Okay. Well, central banks create money. That's what they do. So, the fact that we're going to have a central bank means it will be creating the Scottish currency. And insofar as domestic currency is concerned, the Scottish pound, the central bank does not need to borrow something which it can create at will. Central banks lend money to commercial banks. They don't borrow Scottish pounds.
There's a question for Craig about our common home plan, which you've costed. It's a great piece of work. For their own central bank and currency, finding the money is not going to be a problem. So the question is, do we have the actual resources to deliver this in terms of skill sets, materials, productive capacity, etc., etc.? And if we don't, how long do you think it will take to get there? And what kind of sequencing do we need in order to deliver it?
That is an excellent question that I've been banging on about since we published the Common Home Plan, but I don't think I've ever been spontaneously asked before, so thank you for that question. Because that is the big bottleneck in the plan. Now, we do have, in the later part of the Common Home Plan, we do have that exact sequencing of the amount of productive capacity we do need. I can't remember the number of jobs off the top of my head, but the critical thing in there is that if you think that we can just hire a bunch of plumbers from Norway to lay pipes for district heating systems, you're not going to get a Green New Deal that way, mostly because everywhere on the planet is facing the same climate emergency on the same timescales. So we all need those plumbers. So it is going to be a case of we really need to start reshaping the entire economy. And we've seen the struggles we've been going through to get things like houses properly insulated. And anyone who's tried to do it themselves, trying to get traders to come in, it's impossible. There's just not the people there to do it. This is not the challenge of the Green New Deal is not finding the boots on the ground. It's finding the feet to fill them. To take that insulation example, if you think of the young apprentice who will be insulating your house in 5 years' time, that person is in high school right now. What kind of education is leading them to the path that will lead them to insulating your house? The young apprentice who is insulating the final house in the Green New Deal on the eve of 2045, when Scotland is supposed to be net zero, they're not born yet. So what is the pathway to get them into that job? One person in the Scottish Government, UK Government, I've never really seen mentioned in the context of planning for the climate emergency is the Education Minister. And I think that's a big blind spot we have.
It's a pedagogical question to all three of you. I'm a modern studies teacher by trade, and some of my colleagues have criticised me for this, but Ramsey can't count. But for the last 3 years in my retirement, I've been listening closely to the three of you and others, and I have had a modicum of reprogramming. But in terms of the message, some of it is at times counterintuitive, as you know. And I think that barrier, in a sense, needs to be addressed. I'm not quite sure how, though some of the very big unions in the United States, from time to time, have taken a stab at short social media messages. But I think that's an important issue that needs to develop over the next year or two, is that pedagogical issue in relation to the wider political community whose economic literacy is even lower than my pathetic level.
Of course, right after I get a question about education is the former teacher who asked me a question. Yeah, this is something that, as a think tank, Commonwealth's been wrestling with over the last year or so, in changing the way we communicate. I've had a few conversations throughout today about how people think our greatest strength is our policy papers and the detailed work that goes into that, but then I tell them who reads them. Nobody. They don't really exist to be read. They exist to provide the confidence that they have been written and someone's thought through these issues. Actually getting the message of those policy papers out to people is a big challenge. We did have a policy podcast run for 5 years, and it was getting listenership of on the order of about 500 a week, and I've spoken to a lot of the folk who listened to it, found it very valuable. We started experimenting with short videos online a few months ago, and our first one got about 30,000 views. Just out of the blue. So but how do you then compress the detail of that message into 1 minute on TikTok? It's a very big challenge. And we also exist in the landscape of all that can disappear very quickly. We've seen what has happened to Twitter over the last few years. And TikTok is not exactly a reliable company with its ownership structures. So if we're relying on a vehicle for our message and it gets pulled away from us, what is the next thing that takes its place? It's an ongoing challenge for communicators of all kinds.
Can I just add, I think also Robin brought up a really important point yesterday, is that it should be the case that I think most people in this room are pretty well connected. And it's that thing of speaking one-to-one with people as well. So, you know, it's organising meetings, having speakers, having the discussion afterwards, I think is also a really important way to communicate with people. And yeah, that's work. That's work. You know, when I was the convener of Yes Edinburgh North Leith, you know, you're very busy all the time trying to get the speakers, trying to advertise it, get people in the room, get more and more people in the room. We all have to be busy with that. And I hope that when you go away from this conference this weekend, that everyone feels more confident about teaching other people what you've learned this weekend and bring it out to a wider audience. Because I think, for me, the reason that I do Scotonomics is because I realise, A, a lot of people still believe that we're on the gold standard, right? A lot of people believe that, so that's really problematic, because if you don't even understand what money is, how do you really know what you're voting for when you go to the ballot box? And people need to know more about the financial system for them to be more robust democrats.
Yeah, I think I'm well, not probably my best area for answering, but in the currency group, we've been trying to do short videos. We also do public meetings, so I'd agree with the other speakers that actually speaking to people face to face is very important. Also, my view of experts is that the definition of the expert is somebody who learns the language of the priestly class. Once they've mastered the language of the priestly class, economics, for example, then you never ever say anything which a non-member of the priestly caste will understand. Because your method of being the expert is that nobody has a clue what you're talking about, and they assume that therefore you must be brilliant. So, I always try to in the work that we've been doing with the central bank and so forth, to bring that down to a level where everyone can understand what we're talking about. I think a lot of the sort of professional economists and the sort of politicians and whatever, they obscure what's going on, and they do it deliberately.
Thank you very much. It's been a great weekend. It's been so much to take in. My question hasn't really been answered here yet, because when I'm talking to unionists, their question on the currency and independence is, oh, when you become independent, how much are you going to have to devalue your currency, and how much are the interest rates going to rise? So I'm not sure that either of those two are valid, but can you give me an answer that I can pass on to them?
Well, I'll answer that. And the financial markets are not able to tell you what the value of something is going to be next week. So they can't possibly answer the question of what the value is going to be in 6 or 7 years' time. What you need to consider is that as our Icelandic friend John Eggleston said, the value of the currency can go up or down depending on the strength of your national economy. So if you have an economy like the UK, which has been in decline for a century, well, in fact, the Great Exposition of 1852, whenever it was because Prince Albert thought that the UK was losing its status in the world, and he wanted to try and boost manufacturing. So a relative decline of the UK has been a well-established feature of, certainly since the 1920s. Therefore, the pound has been a weak currency. I think Scotland, post-independence, with all the renewables, the fact that we have, Scotland is 1/3 of the land area of the UK, so we're only 8% of the population. The land and resources available per person is nearly 10 times what is available in England. So you've got all the renewable energy, reasonable food, agricultural land, meat production, fisheries, all of these sort of things are available. So I can see no reason at all why the Scottish economy should not end up being a strong economy.
I'd also add that people get, quite frankly, a little bit phallic about the currency. They equate strength with being good. This idea that if the currency would devalue in Scotland and that would boost the Scottish economy, well, the flip side of that is maybe the British currency is too strong and it's holding back the Scottish economy. I'm not going to come down either way on that. The currency is what you need it to be to do the thing you need to do. The UK's currency has been declining against the dollar for the last couple of decades. Our interest rates are currently 10 times what they were a few years ago. So, yeah, a very wise person in foreign exchange markets once told me, if anyone could reliably and accurately predict a foreign exchange market, there wouldn't be one, because that person would have all the money.
Shall I go? Thanks. I'd like to make a particular point and then a question which is quite separate, if I may. You mentioned education, Craig. I'm a retired teacher. And as far as, preparing a pathway for young people that are not born yet, who are going to have to cope with all the difficulties of climate change. When I was a teacher and I was involved in curriculum development, I did try to put forward the view that this should be like a key criterion for designing what young people would learn. In other words, how do we prepare them for these massive challenges of the future, including climate change, conflict, and so on, mental health issues that we all know about. And my actual subject is very well placed to deal with this, which is psychology. Anyway, it was impossible to have those kind of ideas really put in place, regardless of the fine words, very fine words from Curriculum for Excellence, but it was really difficult to actually get people to focus on preparing young people for what we know is coming down the line. Right, okay, I'll just make that point. I'll leave that question hanging. I don't know how you actually managed to influence policy in that area. But I've got a question, which is actually quite a specific thing, because I enjoyed a presentation yesterday by your colleague, Rory Hamilton. And he talks about the Green New Deal for Scotland and so on. One thing that I'm really interested in is the interconnectors, where, you know, and recently it was in the news, there's this new interconnector, which lo and behold carries all our excess electricity down to England, which we just give away to them. When we are independent, how are we going to manage? We've got this energy that we want to be able to sell. How do we export it without going through England? How are we going to get interconnectors across the North Sea? I'm not sure if this is a rather daft question, but you know, when you see the map of the interconnectors, we need to be able to export to Europe, don't we?
It's a very, very complex question. Our energy group is working on areas around this, and it's not a solved problem. But it's also an aspect of the way that the grid is set up is it does encourage that sort of transmission down south, where maybe we could be thinking about economic policies to bring the demand up north. You know, much more in the way of pricing, so that the electricity is priced cheaper where the electricity is produced to minimise the amount of transmission that is required. There have been examples of countries, Iceland's a good example of this, where I'm not saying this is necessarily the best economic example, but because they had cheap electricity, it became quite useful to import bauxite and export aluminium. Therefore, they didn't need to export the electricity, they exported the things they made with the electricity. So there are other ways to deal with that, but it's an area that's not at the absolute top of my head in the technical details. Some of our energy group include folk who, when they were working, actually ran national grids, and I would defer to them if they were in the room.
I'll expand on that, and I'll say that in the first instance, we probably shouldn't be exporting the electricity, we should be using it. And as Craig said, you know, we export manufactured goods or aluminium or, you know, something that requires the electricity to produce it, so that the Scottish suppliers, you know, we can re-industrialize Scotland by ensuring that the domestic electricity is sold as cheaply as possible. And then then it would be used by us. And if there's electricity left over, then we can export that.
And of course, that's got the potential to bring lots of people over to Scotland, which would be good.
10 years ago this week, we had an independence referendum that brought out 84%, it engaged and inspired 84% of the population to come out and vote. Without having a deadline, a target, is it possible to recreate the type of vibrant democratic debate in dining rooms and pubs and village halls across Scotland to tackle issues like how will Scotland trade internationally, what currency will we have, what is the vision for Scotland? Without having, you know, a deadline to that project, is it actually possible to reinvigorate that kind of debate, to tackle issues we absolutely have to tackle because they're coming at us head first?
My answer, I think that's down to all of us. And you know, I hope that certainly people go away from this conference and they are energised by it, and then it brings ideas. I mean, certainly there's some great ideas came to me through the speakers, which was, you know, we don't have a stock exchange. We have a business here, it's doing really well, it needs more money. Why don't we have a stock exchange? We need to look at that. The taxation system, yes, more transparency. I think so many people agree with that concept. You know, that's something we can do in an independent Scotland. I think there's and also Danny Blanchflower as well, when he's talking about the Monetary Policy Committee, and you know, just the lack of variety of people on the Monetary Policy Committee. It's scandalous. It's absolutely scandalous. And we can do that differently. And so I think there are ideas come out from this conference and any other conference. There's another one coming up with the Independence Convention as well, that's bringing people over from Europe. All of these things, I think, energise us. So people, you know, Tim's organised this. We've done the Scotonomics one. You know, there's another one coming up. We go to these, we take those ideas away and we take them to our local groups. I think, you know, the onus is on us. We've come here, we've got this information. We need to then push it out further away.
Yeah, I mean, to replicate that carnival of independence when you don't know what you're partying for is not going to be easy, and you will hit that barrier of, well, then what? But you can have those conversations on an individual peer-to-peer level. And that is where people get, you do the real work of convincing people to change their minds. And you do it quietly in a way that isn't so noticeable in the carnival, but it's much more persuasive that way. And your challenge, all of you, when you come to the conference next year, bring a friend who wasn't here this year.
Take cake to the meetings. Cake.
Thanks all for really excellent presentations and inspiration. I've been living overseas for nearly 30 years now, so I've been back in this country for 6 months. So supporting independence close up rather than from a distance, which I have been all the time I've been away. And what I see is both encouraging and frustrating, because there's a lot of really good organisations, Commonweal, the Currency Group, Scotonomics, lots of others. I've seen a number of 140 plus somewhere. Are these organisations all connecting with each other, networking, talking? Because I don't actually see a lot of that. And I think, as well as getting people in the audience together to support things, that people that are organising and running these things could maybe be doing more instead, because some of them criticise each other, which is quite hard to watch. Comments, please.
A good chunk of my job is exactly that kind of networking and talking to various groups, not just within our direct political circles, but beyond as well. Like a good chunk of my last year has been working with various groups on engaging with the National Care Service Bill, for instance. That's involved work with dozens and hundreds of people over hundreds and thousands of hours, and we've developed very close ties with a lot of the trade unions that way. And that's talking to them on that particular subject, which can then lead to conversations on other subjects as well. So yes, we are all talking all of the time, even when sometimes it doesn't look that way. But yeah, it's another example of that peer-to-peer kind of networking, that we can all do this. We can all talk to someone in another group and find that commonality between us and see if there is an area where we can work together. It's why we have so many of the organisations here today, for instance.
It's a little bit what the Independence Forum is trying to do. For example, you all had a leaflet on your chairs about the event at the end of November, which is it's not a convention. It's a forum meeting to do some of the work which Robin said yesterday, for example, needed to be done. So I think they're tackling 3 questions, and they've got loads of different groups coming along to consider the questions and try and come up with agreed answers to them. And that's just it's a first step. But there'll be subsequent meetings. It's really tackling questions like what's the position on pensions, what's the border question going to be, that sort of thing. I think we're out of time, so I'm going to impose executive privilege and invite Ian to come and close the conference.
Matter. 2 days of excellent presentations and insights into basically what we need to do in independent Scotland, and that is to create our own currency. And to do that, it's not that difficult. We set up a central bank, a treasury, a financial services authority, and a payment system. And if we do that, if we are independent, and if we have our own currency, I will give you an example of what a difference that would make to some of the problems we've got right now. Because here I have a £1 Scottish £1 note, and I'm about to give this to Ash Regan, because Ash Regan is going to give it to Jim Radcliffe and say, right, we've just bought Grangemouth under compulsory purchase. You have told us it's a donkey. It does make money for you, so we're taking it off your hands. And here you are, Ash. Please take that from me. And we're not finished. because we've got our own currency, we're going to invest 500 million in repurposing Grangemouth, because a just transition starts with ensuring the people that work there today still have jobs into the future, and that Scotland still has a strategic industry using the resources of Scotland. So that's the difference that a currency can make. And I'm going to reflect on one or two of the presentations. Malan for Faeroese. Now, how would we like this in Scotland? If you want to be independent, just say so. That is the official note from the Danish government to the Faeroese government. Scotland, by comparison, we are told now is not the time. And we know why we're told now is not the time, because England needs us. We subsidise England. And England, unfortunately, at the moment, has had a policy of deindustrialising Scotland. All these plants and all the resource and all the capability that we're losing in Scotland is deliberate. It's a political choice, and we have to wake up to that fact. So time is of the essence. I'd like to thank you all in the audience and those online. I can share with you, and until 3 or 4 days ago, we were a bit worried because we're monitoring the number of tickets sold, and it wasn't going too well. But we've had, I think there's 124 people in the room here and about 180 odd online. So over 300 people have participated over the 2 days, which I think is fantastic, and is a great credit for Tim Rideout in particular. You have been a fantastic audience, but I really want a better one. And that better one would be every SNP MP and MSP sitting there and listening to us and being educated in what they have to do to really move towards an independent Scotland. And they have to be upfront and tell the people we have to have our own currency and we're going to improve your lives. And Grangemouth was a classic example of that we could do, and it's really within our own hands to do it. Now, I'm supposed to do final remarks, but I'm going to take my opportunity to say one or two things, because I did start off with, picking up on our John from the Icelandic Bank, because there was something that certainly resonated with me in my remarks yesterday. My ambition for Scotland is that we use our own resources to create well-paid jobs in Scotland and rebuild our economy after the devastation of Thatcher and everything that's came from the British state since the time of Thatcher. Now, I think John he expressed it much better than I did yesterday, because he said, optimise economic growth and create human capital. And yes, I would sign up for that, for an independent Scotland. And actually, it takes us back to something that was said earlier today, because in the morning session, there was reference twice to Adam Smith. This is the tricentenary year of his birth in Dunfermline. And one of the things that Margaret Thatcher, although she often referred to the wealth of nations and Adam Smith, one of the statements he made, she never, ever referred to, because he said, in the wealth of nations, the criteria should be the well-being of the people. The well-being of the people. And that's really what we're all about. And coming from the conference ourselves, we are hoping to take it to a new and more professional stage for the Scottish Currency Group. We do hope to create a Scottish Monetary Research Institute. Now, that is the next phase for us in the Currency Group, but that will be dependent on us seeking funding. So look out if you see a crowdfunding appeal, because we're going to look to actually recruit professional people. We all do it as willing volunteers, etc. But we do think we need to take the debate further forward, and maybe then we'll be able to engage with the SNP. Who knows? But it would be nice to think so. Anyway, to sum up, I'd like to say a big thank you to Tim Rideout in particular. Not only for putting together 2 days of an excellent agenda,